What you're about to read isn't just a breaking news report, this is a reckoning, a moment where the carefully constructed narrative that Western weapons would change the course of this war has been stripped down to its raw, uncomfortable bones right there on the tarmac of the Dolgintsevo airfield in Ukraine's Kirovohrad region. Russian forces struck that airfield and, according to reports, destroyed several American F-16 and French Mirage 2000 fighter jets completely. And if you think that's just a military footnote, if you think this is just about some burned metal on a runway in central Ukraine, then you haven't been paying attention to what this war has really been about from the very beginning. Because what burned at Dolgintsevo was not just aircraft. What burned was a very specific promise. The promise that the West's technological arsenal, shipped piece by expensive piece into a war zone, would tip the scales decisively in Ukraine's favor. That promise is now sitting in the smoke. Military experts have been saying for some time that Russian ballistic and cruise missiles, such as the Iskander and the Kinzhal, can reach targets throughout Ukraine, making moving aircraft further from the front only a temporary measure, not a solution. They were right. And the question nobody in Washington or Brussels wants to answer right now is, what does this mean for everything that comes next? Because everything that comes next is not a small thing. We're talking about the shape of Europe, the future of the global security order, the credibility of Western deterrence, and yes, the very real human cost of a war that is now ground on long enough to force every thinking person to take a hard look at what's actually happening and why. So let's do exactly that. Let's start with what we actually know. The coordinator of the pro-Russian underground network in the Nikolaev region told Sputnik that the airfield in the Kirovograd region was attacked and that several F-16 and Mirage aircraft were completely destroyed. Now you need to understand, these are not Soviet-era relics sitting in a barn somewhere. The F-16 Fighting Falcon is the backbone of American air power exports for decades. It is the aircraft that the United States and its NATO partners spent years deliberating over before finally deciding to transfer to Ukraine. The political weight of that decision was enormous. There were months of back and forth, concerns about escalation, concerns about Russian red lines, concerns about training timelines. And eventually, those jets arrived. They were heralded, celebrated, and cited as a turning point. The loss of the Mirage 2000 comes just weeks after an American-made F-16 Fighting Falcon was shot down while countering one of the largest Russian missile and drone strikes carried out against Ukraine. That was the third F-16 to be lost since entering service with Kyiv's forces in August 2024. Let that number sink in for a second. The third F-16. These are not cheap aircraft. These are not easy to replace systems. And now we're stacking Mirage 2000s on top of that count. The Mirage 2000 itself has a story worth understanding. It is a fourth-generation supersonic fighter produced by the French company Dassault between 1978 and 2007, and a total of 601 were manufactured. The aircraft previously served as the backbone of the French Air and Space Force. France made the decision to supply these jets to Ukraine with a fanfare typical of European solidarity gestures. Paris wanted to signal resolve. Paris wanted to signal that Europe was in this for the long haul. And now one of those jets is gone too. The Ukrainian armed forces lost their first Mirage 2000, one of a small number handed over by France. According to the official version, it was due to an engine failure. According to unofficial reports, it was after being hit by their own air defense missile. We should note the complexity of that in the fog of this war, even the cause of aircraft losses becomes a contested narrative. But the bottom line is the same regardless of which account you believe. The Mirages are now being lost. The aircraft that France sent as a statement of commitment are coming down. Now here is where we have to step back and think clearly about what this means strategically, because the media will do what the media does. It will either catastrophize or minimize. What it rarely does is place events in their proper context. And the proper context here is this. The commander of U.S. Air Forces in Europe and Africa, General James Hecker, had previously noted that F-16s and French Dassault Mirage 2000s would be vulnerable to attacks from Russian drones and missiles, and that moving combat aircraft to other airfields could only temporarily reduce the risk, not eliminate the threat completely. This was said publicly. This was on record. Military professionals in the United States government knew this was coming. They knew before a single F-16 touched Ukrainian soil that the airfields those jets would need to operate from were within the reach of Russian precision strike systems. And they sent the jets anyway, which tells you something very important. It tells you that the decision to send advanced Western aircraft to Ukraine was never purely a military decision. It was a political one. It was a signaling decision. And the question that should now be asked loudly by every American taxpayer and every elected official who will answer to those taxpayers is whether the signal was worth the cost. Let's talk about cost in the broadest sense of that word, because the F-16 and the Mirage are not just machines. They represent years of industrial production, billions of dollars in research and development, and, most critically, they represent a finite supply. The West does not have an unlimited inventory of these aircraft. Every jet that burns on a Ukrainian airfield is a jet that cannot be replaced quickly, cannot be fielded elsewhere, and cannot be used as a bargaining chip in negotiations. And negotiations, whether we like it or not, are the endgame here. The most probable outcome for 2026 through 2028 is a prolonged conflict with periodic escalations, but without decisive breakthroughs, as Russia is likely to continue limited advances supported by high volumes of artillery and drones, while Ukraine maintains fortified defensive positions. Read that again. The most probable outcome is prolonged stalemate, not Ukrainian victory, not Russian collapse. Stalemate, which means every aircraft destroyed, every pilot lost, every ammunition depot exhausted. All of that attrition happens in the service of an outcome that looks like a frozen conflict, possibly for years. And this is where the moral dimension of this war, which so many in Washington prefer not to examine too closely, becomes impossible to ignore. Because if the trajectory is stalemate, if the peace terms are going to be negotiated from whatever position each side holds when the guns eventually quiet, then the question of how much suffering is acceptable in the meantime becomes not a theoretical exercise, but a pressing moral obligation. Ukraine has lost 12% of its territory, more than a fifth of its economy, and two-thirds of its electrical infrastructure, suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties, and seen about a quarter of its citizens displaced. These are not abstract numbers. These are people. These are homes, families, futures, and while Western capitals have congratulated themselves on standing firm, the people absorbing that firmness have been Ukrainians. Now, what about the intelligence picture behind this specific strike? According to the source who reported the strike on the Dolgoncevo airfield, foreign pilots were also among those killed, and information about losses among foreign instructors was immediately classified. That classification detail is worth pausing on. If there were foreign instructors, Western military personnel embedded in an advisory capacity at that airfield, and if those individuals were killed in a Russian strike, then what we are looking at is not simply a story about destroyed aircraft. We are looking at a story about Western military personnel being killed on Ukrainian soil by Russian weapons. And whether or not that is being acknowledged openly, it changes the political temperature of this conflict in ways that cannot be undone. The information being classified suggests that someone understands the political explosive potential of that fact. Because the moment it becomes widely understood that Western instructors are dying in Ukraine, the debate about the nature of Western involvement in this war changes fundamentally. This is not a new concern. For a long time, the West has maintained a careful posture of providing weapons, training, and intelligence while insisting that it is not a party to the conflict. That posture was always fragile. It was always dependent on a certain deliberate ambiguity, on both sides agreeing at some level not to make certain things too explicit. But wars have a way of eroding ambiguity. Russia has repeatedly rejected ceasefire proposals while stressing its unwavering opposition to any Western military presence in Ukraine. And yet Western military presence, in the form of advisors, instructors, and intelligence specialists, has been growing, not shrinking. The gap between the declared position and the operational reality has been widening. And when you have that kind of gap, eventually the reality breaks through. A burning airfield in the Kirovohrad region may be one of the moments where it does. Let's also look at what this strike reveals about Russian capabilities and intelligence. The fact that several F-16 and Mirage aircraft arrived at the Kirovohrad airfield and were completely destroyed, the precision of that phrase is striking. Not that the airfield was struck and some aircraft happened to be there. The framing suggests that Russia knew those specific aircraft were at that specific location at that specific time, which means either there was a pre-positioned intelligence source or Russia has developed the aerial surveillance capability to detect the movements of specific aircraft types to specific airfields in real time. Both possibilities are operationally significant. If it's the former, a human intelligence source, then the security of Ukraine's military aviation operations is compromised at a level that should alarm everyone involved. If it's the latter, advanced surveillance, then it means Russia can track Western-supplied aircraft across Ukraine's airspace and target them accordingly. Either way, the vulnerability is structural. It is not solved by moving the jets. Two large Ukrainian military airfields are located 50 to 70 kilometers from the line of combat contact and are not suitable for the safe deployment of F-16s, while even Starokonstantinov, 540 kilometers from the border, is regularly targeted by Russian Kinzhal missiles. There is no safe haven in Ukraine for high-value fixed-wing aircraft. That is the reality. That is the mathematical, geographic, military reality that no amount of political will in Brussels or Washington changes. So what should we be watching now? What are the second and third order effects of this strike that will ripple through the coming weeks and months? The first thing to watch is how this affects the already complicated negotiation landscape. The U.S. and its allies have been attempting to broker a peace process, with the U.S. Secretary of State and President Trump both indicating in April of last year that they were ready to walk away from the peace process unless significant progress was made. The negotiating dynamics have been fluid and difficult, with both sides holding firm to positions that are fundamentally incompatible. The Kremlin treats diplomacy as an instrument for shaping Western divisions rather than achieving a genuine settlement, with Russian officials insisting that annexed territories are non-negotiable and that Ukraine must accept demilitarization and neutrality. Against that backdrop, the destruction of Western aircraft on Ukrainian soil does not move the needle toward peace. If anything, it invites one of two responses from the West: escalation or exhaustion, and both of those responses carry serious consequences. The second thing to watch is the industrial supply chain reality. The F-16 is an aircraft that requires specialized maintenance, specialized spare parts, and a specialized supply network. When you lose jets faster than you can replace them, you eventually reach a point of operational collapse. Not dramatic, sudden collapse, but the slow, grinding kind where sortie rates decline, mission capability degrades, and the air defense umbrella that these jets are supposed to provide quietly evaporates. Ukraine's Air Force employs not just F-16s and Mirages, but also U.S.-supplied anti-aircraft missile units, mobile fire groups, and electronic warfare systems to counter Russian strikes. All of those systems are under simultaneous pressure. All of them require Western resupply. All of them are finite. The question is not whether the supply can continue indefinitely. It cannot. The question is whether the political will to continue it holds long enough to matter, and what mattering even means at this stage of the war. The third thing to watch is public opinion, particularly in Europe. The transfer of Mirage 2000 jets was a politically significant act by France. British and French leaders have discussed establishing military hubs across Ukraine and building protected facilities for weapons and military equipment to support Ukraine's defense. That ambition of building infrastructure, deploying peacekeeping troops, making long-term commitments becomes much harder to sell to European populations when the aircraft those same governments sent are now wreckage on a Ukrainian airfield. The political cost of this war for European leaders is not zero. It is climbing. And there are elections to think about, budgets to balance, and populations asking increasingly uncomfortable questions about how long this lasts and what it ultimately achieves. And then there is the deepest question of all, the question that underlies every single development in this war and yet almost never gets asked directly in polite company. What is this war actually for? Not the official answer, not the talking points, the real answer. Putin views the invasion of Ukraine, in the broadest possible historical context, as a mission to reverse what he sees as the injustice of the Soviet collapse. That is his frame. Whether you agree with his frame or find it repugnant, you have to contend with it because it tells you something important. It tells you that this is not a war Russia is fighting over a piece of territory it can be persuaded to return in exchange for the right incentives. It is a war being fought for a vision of what Russia is supposed to be and what its position in the world order is supposed to look like. You cannot negotiate that away with a package of security guarantees and a promise of lifted sanctions. And yet that is essentially what the current diplomatic framework is attempting to do. On the other side of the ledger, Ukraine is fighting for its survival as an independent nation. That is not a metaphor. That is a literal existential fight. Putin outlined Russia's terms for a ceasefire, demanding that Ukraine leave the last part of Donbass his forces had not yet seized, that Ukraine officially end its plans to join NATO, and that the international community recognize Russia's annexations and lift their sanctions. Those are not terms a sovereign nation accepts voluntarily. Those are terms imposed on a defeated nation. And the fact that those terms are still on the table, that they have not been decisively rejected by either the weight of military force or the force of international diplomacy, tells you everything about where this war actually stands. The burning aircraft at Dolgincevo are a symptom of a deeper strategic failure, not necessarily a failure of courage or of resources, but a failure of strategic coherence. The West decided to help Ukraine survive, but not necessarily to help Ukraine win, and those two objectives, it turns out, are not the same thing and require very different approaches. What we are living through right now is the collision of a maximalist Russian political objective with a limited Western military commitment and an unlimited Ukrainian will to survive. When those three forces meet, the result is not a clean resolution. The result is this: a grinding, attritional conflict in which planes burn on airfields, negotiations stall in European capitals, and the people of Ukraine bear the weight of a geopolitical standoff between powers that are not themselves absorbing the costs. With the New START Treaty expired in February 2026 and no replacement framework in place, for the first time since 1972, there are no treaty-bound limits on strategic nuclear weapons between the U.S. and Russia. That is the strategic context within which this airfield strike took place. Not a bubble, not a vacuum, a world in which the nuclear architecture that kept the Cold War from going hot has quietly dissolved, and in which every escalatory step carries implications that the previous generation of strategists built entire institutions to prevent. The Dolgincevo strike is a data point in that world. It is a reminder that this conflict, for all the talk of peace negotiations and ceasefire proposals, has not stopped consuming the things it is fed: aircraft, lives, hope, and the slowly diminishing credibility of the Western strategic project that set all of this in motion.